Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
Former Prime Minister Harold Wilson opined in the days before social media that a week is a long time in politics. I tell you, it's been a long, hard 52 weeks at the political coalface. Joining us now is a proper gentleman, a knight of the realm, veteran chairman of a powerful select committee, a man of independent mind. Everything, in short, a parliamentarian should be, except for the fact that he's a Conservative. Sir Edward Leigh MP, welcome to the Sputnik. On that point, you have sound views on the Iraq war, which you opposed, on the Middle East crisis, on the plight of Christians in Syria and so on. You share with me a Roman Catholic background, opposition to euthanasia and abortion and so on. How can you still be a right-wing Conservative? Which part of the Holy Father's message on capitalism over the last 12 months or so did you miss?
Well, I'm just beginning to wonder if I'm a right-wing Conservative, actually. Maybe I've got it wrong all my life. I am a right-wing Conservative in this. You probably wouldn't approve of this, George. I am a Thatcherite in economics. You know, I believe in a flat tax system, which the Conservative Party has never introduced or gone anywhere near. I believe in education vouchers in schools. So I buy that Thatcherite agenda. But you're right, because I'm a Catholic, I'm slightly idiosyncratic in terms of social conscience. And Michael Gove said to me that I support the Pope in everything apart from European integration.
And one more other thing, because I believe you've been a minister for a short while in John Major's government. But other than that, you've been a backbencher in your whole parliamentary career. Why are you not in the front bench?
Well, that's a very good question. I sometimes ask that all the time. Why have I never been put on the front bench? Why was I sacked by John Major? Actually, he tapped me on the knee when he sacked me, and he said, there's nothing to do with your competence, but he said, you're just too independent-minded, really.
That's
You'd be happy on the
back bench. It's a badge of honour. Before we leave the church, Francis is the best thing that ever happened to the Catholic Church in my lifetime, at least. He is, in his way of life, and in the courage with which he's confronting issues, and the clarity with which he's speaking about exploitation and the poor and so on, I find it unprecedented, and it is reviving the church in many places. Are you a fan?
I'm a great fan because he comes from a new world. Actually, I didn't mind Benedict because, probably unlike you, I'm quite a traditional Catholic. For instance, I love the Latin Mass, and Benedict was a superb theologian. And I met him once, and he had a tremendous twinkle in his eye, but undoubtedly he was a bit dry for many people. Although his speech, which we heard together in Westminster Hall, was a brilliant exposition on the state of British politics. But Francis is a man of the people, comes from the new world, articulates a sort of new faith, which I think people find very appealing. It is much more open than perhaps Benedict was.
One of the stories of the year has been the horrific fate of Christians in Iraq, most of them Catholics, Chaldeans, after the impact of the US-UK invasion and occupation began to effectively shatter Iraq into 1,000 pieces. And then a repeat performance in Syria, where Western-backed rebels are murdering priests, even bishops, destroying churches. This is a matter I know that you pay a lot of attention to. Would you summarize it?
Well, yes, because I went actually to Iraq during Saddam's time, and I make no defence of him, but I went to northern Iraq, where the Christians are, and it was an absolutely peaceful situation. I know, not politically free, but free for ordinary people. Then I went back a few years later to northern Iraq, and the position of the Assyrian Christians is appalling. Because we wrongly invaded Iraq, we have condemned hundreds of thousands of people to death. And we have condemned tens of thousands of Christians to death and to flight. And the situation now in those villages that I visited just 2 or 3 years ago is even worse. They're being enslaved, beheaded by ISIL. So what a disaster. I know Saddam was appalling in every respect politically in terms of repression, but he was no threat to the West, and actually he protected Christians. And actually so does Assad.
Indeed, the Syrian picture is almost a replica of that. We had, sitting in this very chair, Mother Agnes, the Mother Superior of Homs and Hama, a gentle woman, saintly woman, as she talked about the life of Christians in Syria before and after this disaster. I said to William Hague, you've been wrong before, indeed you've been wrong most of your life, but you've never been insane before. Your policy of supporting these jihadists in Syria is literally insane.
Well, I mean, our whole policy is insane. You remember that vote we had last year? The pressure on people like me as Conservative MPs to support the Prime Minister to bomb Assad. Yeah. The Prime Minister actually summoned me, and I sat as closer to this. He begged me to support him, and I didn't in the end. But Assad, again, for all his faults, and I've been to Damascus, I went to Straight Street. This is the home of Christianity. This is where St. Paul, after his conversion, went to this little house in the middle of Damascus. And now we have condemned again, because of our insane policy, of death, destruction, and mayhem. And I mean, you couldn't make it up. Really.
You couldn't make it up. And the danger of a Middle East entirely free of Christians, because they've had to flee or die. That's the prospect that we're looking at. Moving on, you mentioned the Prime Minister. We're coming to the end of the Parliament. What would be your report card if you were writing it for him?
For David Cameron? Well, I'm not entirely on message. You've got to understand that with the Cameroon project. I mean, I accept that he's very bright. He's very personable. I personally have no personal difficulty with him at all. I think he's actually quite a nice chap in many ways. But I think what he's done, and I've said this to his face, is he has created UKIP. He's attempted to move the party to the centre on things like gay marriage. And he's alienated hundreds of thousands of older Conservative voters who, unfortunately, are now voting UKIP. And if we're going to lose the election, and obviously I hope as a loyal Conservative we win, I don't want to see Ed Miliband in Downing Street. If we lose the election, it will be because David Cameron has created this monster UKIP, which is eating up our support.
It is a monster, isn't it, UKIP? I mean, you are a Eurosceptic, and that's why he lost his position in the major government. But this is something beyond Euroscepticism, the UKIP phenomenon. It is dredging a pond in which many horrors live at the bottom. It's creating, in my opinion, an unsettled, unhappy swathe of our population, which is potentially quite dangerous.
It's like all right-wing insurgencies. They start by saying everything's really miserable in the country. And there are some bad things, but let's face it, you're pretty fortunate to live in this country. First of all, they convince you life is miserable. They then say this is the fault of a minority. And at the moment, it's the minority is the Poles, or the Lithuanians, who I personally think are actually very hard-working, and all the rest of it. And the last century...
Good Catholics too.
Yeah, well, I wasn't going to say that. or the Bulgarians and Romanians. In the last century, it was the Jews, they were all to fault, the right-wing insurgencies were saying. And then they make some progress, but then they tend to implode because actually they get too ambitious and they break towards the left. And I think this is what Farage is doing now. I mean, I joke that I wouldn't join UKIP because they're not Thatcherite enough and they're not right-wing enough. He's actually a populist, and he's trying now to win seats in the north in Labour areas. I don't think he's going to, but he's starting to make his message a bit incoherent. Do you understand me? It's no longer a straight Thatcherite message.
No, and the National Health Service is a very good case in point. They were for privatising it just 12 months ago, and now they're posing as its redoubtable defenders. You've been in Parliament now for more than 30 years. That's a life sentence. Even Mandela only served 27. I see that you are running again, and I see that John Prescott's son has just been chosen as your Labour opponent. But you must be feeling fairly confident with your 10,000 majority.
Well, I'm thrilled that he's standing. It's a bit of glamour in Lincolnshire, and I think he lives in Lincolnshire. I think he lives in my constituency, so I welcome him. I actually welcome a big Labour vote, because I'm afraid not only is he 10,000 votes behind, it's worse than that. He's in third place. So the more people who vote Labour is the fewer people who vote UKIP. So I welcome him. I'm sure he'll be an excellent candidate. I think this is maybe a first try for him, and then he'll stand in Hull next time and get elected for Labour.
You mentioned Ed Miliband. He's scarcely setting the heather on fire, especially not in Scotland where there is heather. But according to the opinion polls, Labour is likely to be the largest party in the next Parliament. Of course, the impact of UKIP cannot fully be calibrated. What sort of Prime Minister do you think Ed Miliband would make?
Well, I think he'd be absolutely hopeless. I think he's just I wouldn't mind if he was a real lefty, but the fact is that he's just sort of classic establishment left. And of course, I hate all the things like mansion tax and all that. So, I mean, I do assure you that even the most independent-minded Conservative MPs are desperate to stop Ed getting into Downing Street.
So you can get back into bed with Nick Clegg?
Absolutely not. I loathe him. I think he's the biggest hypocrite in British politics. I can't stand the man. I mean, if we're the largest party, this time, we're going to not let Cameron boss us around on this. We're going to have a vote in the 22 committee on the Saturday morning, and when a vote against the coalition, and we're going to go it alone as a minority government, as we should have done last time, because coalitions don't work. It's the lowest common denominator government.
Finally, 2014, lots has happened the past year. What's been the big event to you?
I think the biggest event has been the Scottish referendum, which was a fantastic display of democracy. And actually, although you wouldn't think it, we won. You know, we've kept the union. And I'm a romantic high Tory. I think preserving the United Kingdom is much more important than anything else, even English votes for English laws. It's the great victory of the year.
Scotland isn't finished, though, Sir Edward. We fought the referendum. We were all over the country, dozens of public meetings. And we won, you're right, but it's not over yet. I caution you and other English Tories that provocations like this, English votes for English laws and so on, are manna from heaven for the SNP. I really think those who want to keep our small island in this small world together have to move very cautiously and sensitively on this matter.
I was the only Tory MP in the statement this week, William Hague's statement, who just made that kind of cautionary remark. As I've just said, I said the union is more important than anything else. And I say all my colleagues on the Tory benches were getting a bit overexcited about this. The number of purely English bits of business are really very small. And actually, you could deal with this by a sort of double veto. You could let Scottish MPs, English MPs, just to the committee stage, and then have a double vote with all of us and just English MPs on third reading. There has to be a compromise. You're right. You can't just change. I'm a Conservative. I don't believe in sudden changes in the Constitution. So do it slowly, do it by consensus, and don't provoke the Scots, because one more provocation and we could lose this union.
Indeed, and there were moments in the campaign when we thought we were going to lose. Sir Edward Leigh, you're a great man. I think you and I should form our own party. We'd sweep the country. Coming up after the break, Ben Fogle on the Chagos Islands. You may not have heard of them, but after his interview, you'll never forget them. Welcome back to Sputnik. Almost unbelievably, in 1971, the British overseas territory of the Chagos Islands was emptied of its entire population and handed over to the US Air Force, the better for them to bomb and kill the people of Vietnam.
There was no Falkland Island-style sovereignty for the Chagosians. They were the wrong colour for a start. It was ethnic cleansing on a mass scale.
In the War on Terror, it became clear, despite the lie in Parliament to the contrary by the then Foreign Secretary David Miliband, the US base there on Diego Garcia, still British territory, was used for secret rendition flights of bewildered and blindfolded kidnappees on their way to secret prisons for unspeakable tortures.
Miliband's parting shot, a coup de grace, which killed all remaining hopes of the Chagos Islanders to return to their homes, was to declare the island as the largest marine protected area in the world, i.e. too environmentally sensitive for the human beings who once lived there to return.
Joining us now is the redoubtable campaigner for the rights of the Chagos Islanders, television personality, all-round adventurer, and the first of our guests, I think, to have his own waxwork at Madame Tussauds. He's Ben Fogle. Ben, thanks for joining us. Chagos, Diego Garcia, Chagosians. Most British people don't know what we're talking about. Why is that?
It falls under the headline, the British Indian Ocean Territories, and it's one of these awful stories that just goes over people's heads. Some people might have read about it, but for some reason it doesn't stick. And I don't know why. And I've been involved with this for many, many years. And the headline is very simple. The story is very simple. That back in the 70s, as you mentioned, the US was looking for a military base in the Indian Ocean. They discovered this small territory, used to be part of Mauritius, which was part of the British Empire, but it got annexed shortly before this deal was done. And the British government agreed to lease Diego Garcia. This is the main island. The British Indian Ocean territories as a whole is made up of many, many islands. Diego Garcia is the largest. And a deal was given to the US for them to lease it for 50 years to build this huge military base. And the people were written out of history.
Why did the people have to be removed? There are many places with military bases, but they've still got people.
The US predicted, way ahead of what has recently been discovered, that this was going to be a very secretive place. They didn't want any human... Part of the deal was that there could be no natives, as they called them. There could be no native population there. So Whitehall went back, suddenly discovered that there were between 1,500 and 1,800 islanders, Chagosian people living there, and they decided to wipe them off the face of the earth. I don't mean kill them. They stripped them of their passports. Up until that stage, they had British citizenship, and they deported them, where they put them in refugee camps in Mauritius and the Seychelles, the two nearest island chains, and they were forgotten about until various people started campaigning. And then in 2000, the late Robin Cook agreed to return their passports. They won a High Court bid for the right to return. Their passports were returned to them, and a number came over to the UK and settled very close to Gatwick, where they landed. They settled in Crawley, and that's where they've lived ever since. But that might seem like a large number of people, 400, but they are effectively voiceless. And that's why me, a white Englishman, have spent the last 10, 15 years trying to campaign on their part, trying to bring this to the forefront of politics.
Well, thank God for you. It's nothing for the Americans to ethnically cleanse territories. That's what their state was based upon. What is remarkable to me, that in the 1970s, quite a radical decade, this wasn't seen as the gigantic scandal that it now seems, at least to me. Did it make no impact when Whitehall agreed to this? It was
all done very secretively. And you alluded to the Falkland Islands. It was just a decade later, when we were going to war to fight for the rights of those islanders. It doesn't make sense except for the colour. The fact that the Falkland Islanders are white and the people from the Chagosians have much darker skin. And that's what I can understand, that the people, perhaps in Great Britain, didn't care. I don't know exactly why there wasn't a bigger fuss made up. Interestingly, a couple of years later, it was revealed that about 800 dogs, the pets of all the islanders, had been gassed at the time, and that was almost front-page news. People were more horrified that the dogs had been killed. But it was symbolic of...
So the US didn't even want the Labradors to see what they were doing?
They didn't even want dogs on the islands. And what really angered me was several years ago, when this marine protectorate, marine status was given to the islands, was rolled through. I was asked to back this bid by a number of environmental organisations. I am a self-confessed environmentalist. I'm a conservationist, and I was happy to do it on the understanding the islanders would still have the opportunity to return. But of course, what we've since discovered is this MPA, this Marine Protectorate Area, effectively excludes any opportunity to land,
to borrow
because they could never, you know, a lot of people have asked, well, if they did return, what could they do? How could they possibly resettle these islands? Well, fishing would be a big mainstay, and I have been fortunate enough to visit these islands. This is one of the reasons I'm so passionate about it. I visited about 10 years ago. I went in pseudo-legally, but I actually got chased away by the British Navy. Interestingly, they were the ones that patrolled the water.
So where did you travel from and to?
I started my journey down in the Maldives, right down in the most southern area. I found a boat and I chartered it. It took a couple of days to get there. And what really horrified me was not just visiting these islands, which are full of the derelict homes. There's still magazines, there's cups. It's like a place frozen in. It's like a ghost town. It's like a place where people have The door has opened, they've been told, get out, and they've left everything as it was. The houses are now obviously have been encroached by the jungle, but the churches are still there, the graveyard is still there, the shops, you have a real sense of the place it once was, a thriving community where people lived very, very happily. And what's even more shocking is that there are now kind of new age travellers. I don't mean that in that sense, but there are now yachts, men and women from all across the world living there, living in these houses. So they're not supposed to be there. So I couldn't get my head around the fact that these islanders, who are a disparate group in Mauritius, Seychelles and London, Crawley now, why they're not allowed to go home, and yet these people who have the benefit of their own boats can go back to these islands. It didn't make sense. We tried to get closer to Diego Garcia, and the Royal Navy came up to us and very politely asked us to move on. But I was there for long enough to see that in my eyes, my opinion, those islands could be resettled. There's just been a feasibility study. I went to see William Hague last year to ask about this feasibility study. He got KPMG to do this report, and they have come up with, I suppose you could argue it's relatively positive. They have said that there is no legal obstacle to the islanders returning. They've estimated that for 150 islanders it would cost £11 million a year. I think that's way too high. Maybe that's my adventuring background. I think life could be done much simpler than that. They don't need a great big hospital. They need a very simple little medical facility, get volunteer doctors. I've always argued that if this marine protectorate area is there to stay, then let's bring back the islanders in the capacity as wardens, as protectors. Let's make them look after this area themselves. And that's the excuse for them to go back. Let's bring scientists back. They can study. So I don't see that there is anything to preclude their return. But the government, consecutively, both Labour and Conservative governments have made it, and the coalition now, have made it increasingly hard for the islanders to return, and I think, quite frankly, they wish that this would just disappear. But it's people like me, and I'm not the only one, incidentally. There are a group of us who've been campaigned for many, many years, try to keep this in the headlines. And next year, it's going to go to Parliament, and it's down to MPs to decide on the fate of the Chagosians. It's our Parliament who will once and for all make that decision as to whether islanders can go back to Diego Garcia and live within sight of the airfield. I don't think the US have anything to hide now. We know what's just been going on. The CIA released it.
Ben, you mentioned in the beginning that there was a 50 years lease given to the Americans, but some 20 years left. What happens at the end of that 20 years?
Well, actually, the 50 years is up now because it was done in '64, so it's over now. But there was an extension, a possible extension of 20 years, which is actually was included in it. So that is accepted that it will go ahead, unless there are extenuating circumstances. I would personally argue that the revelations that the islands were used as a place of torture would be extenuating circumstances. The Chagosian people themselves, the Chagosian support group, based here in the UK certainly, have agreed that they will back that 20 years as long as the US agree to let them return to Diego Garcia Island itself. It would be a natural place for them to begin the re-inhabitation of the islands. There's water, there's electricity, they've got all the basic infrastructure that they could possibly need.
They've got their own houses still.
Well, there's 4,000 US military people that live there. They've got swimming pools, they've got basketball courts, they've got cafeterias. The US have lived there very, very happily for 50 years, so why can't the Chagosian people?
It's hard work, but somebody's got to do it. The revelations that you allude to there are dark and sinister. Not only that Diego Garcia may have been a staging post for these renditions, which are effectively international kidnappings, but that torture at the base may also have taken place. Can you shed any light on that?
I can't necessarily shed any light except for speak for my own opinions or thoughts on that. It's horrific. It's horrific on a basic level that these tortures happened anyway, but the fact that we have leased these islands to the Americans makes us complicit. Yes. Whether we discover any more details about how involved we were in these tortures, I don't know. But the bottom line is that we leased these islands, arguably in good faith, but that simply was not the case. And that's why I will carry on fighting this campaign.
Well, God bless you. I was there when David Miliband spoke. I saw his lips move when he denied that any of these rendition flights had passed through Diego Garcia. It was a bright, shining lie. Ben Fogle, thanks very much. More power to your elbow.
Thank you.
Alas, that's all we've got time for.
Do stay in touch with us in the new year on Twitter, RT_Sputnik, and on Facebook, you can like us on Sputnik on Russia Today. Happy New Year from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous, most of it.